Ask why a Syrian family ends up in Germany rather than Saudi Arabia, and you will hear answers about money, welfare, and generosity. Every one of them misses the mechanism. Here is the mechanism. In Europe, a person who physically reaches the territory can lodge an asylum claim. No visa, no invitation, no sponsor, no one's permission. The claim itself creates obligations. The state has to hear it, shelter them while it is heard, and cannot remove them while it is pending. It is the one door on earth that opens from the outside. In the 6 Gulf states, Saudi Arabia, the Emirates, Qatar, Kuwait, Bahrain, and Oman, that door does not exist. Not because it is guarded, because it was never built. Not one of the 6 has ever signed the 1951 Refugee Convention.
In their law, there is no application to file, no status to be granted, no refusal to appeal, because there is no decision to be made. What exists instead is kafala. Your right to be in the country is held by an employer. Your stay is temporary by design. The road to citizenship is, for practically everyone, closed permanently. So people are not running toward kindness, and they are not running toward wealth. Qatar is wealthier. They are running toward the only rich region on earth where arriving is itself a legal act. And once you see that, the last 10 years of European policy turn into a single project, closing that door without ever admitting out loud that it is there. Start with the assumption buried in the question because it does not survive 5 minutes with the numbers. Muslim refugees, as a population, are not walking past Muslim countries on their way to Europe.
The overwhelming majority never get near Europe. They are in Muslim countries right now, in quantities no European state has ever had to handle. By the middle of 2025, there were roughly 42.5 million refugees in the world. 2/3 of them came from 5 places: Afghanistan, Syria, Sudan, Ukraine, and Venezuela. 71% of them live in low and middle-income countries, and almost always in the ones sharing a border with whatever they escaped. The largest hosting countries are Colombia, Germany, Turkey, Uganda, Iran, Chad, and Pakistan. On that list, Germany is the exception, not the pattern. Iran held close to 3.5 million refugees at the end of 2024. Turkey holds over 2.9 million. Together, Iran and Pakistan shelter 4 out of every 5 Afghan refugees alive. Jordan and Lebanon absorbed Syrians at ratios that would have brought down any government in Western Europe. At the peak, something like 1 in every 4 or 5 people standing on Lebanese soil was a Syrian who had fled the war. Not one of those countries is wealthy. All of them are Muslim majority. So, the moral version of the question dies here. The Muslim world is not refusing these people. It is carrying most of them on a fraction of European money and with almost none of the credit. And the same is true well beyond the Muslim world. Colombia absorbed millions of Venezuelans with a small share of Germany's resources and virtually no international attention.
Uganda runs one of the most generous refugee regimes that exists anywhere, handing out land and the right to work on a national income per head that is a rounding error next to any European countries. What Jordan and Lebanon did was harder still, and it did not hold. Both took Syrians at proportions European states spent 10 years calling impossible, and both have since restricted heavily. Because absorbing that share of a population without the money to match it is not sustainable, and never was. Remember that. because it is going to come back at the end of this video with a body count attached. But keep going, because the interesting part is not how many they take, it is what they take them as. Turkey is the cleanest example, and almost nobody outside refugee law knows about it. Turkey did sign the 1951 Convention. It signed with a geographical limitation, which it has never lifted. The limitation restricts refugee status to people escaping events that happen in Europe and nowhere else. So the 3 million Syrians inside Turkey are not, in law, refugees. They hold temporary protection, a separate regime invented in 2011 for exactly this population. It provides assistance and permission to remain. It is not status, and it does not carry what status carries. Read that again. The biggest host in the region declines to recognize nearly everyone it shelters as what they visibly are. That is the regional norm, rather than a regional scandal. Take people in, sometimes in enormous numbers, feed and shelter them, and decline to hand over the legal category that would make the arrangement permanent and enforceable against you. The Gulf did not invent that approach. It simply took it to the end of the line. None of the 6 Gulf Cooperation Council states has ever signed the Refugee Convention. 75 years after it was written, not one has joined. And the consequence is not a harder border. It is an empty space where the law should be. There is no asylum application in the Gulf because no such application exists. No status is granted because no status was ever created. Nothing is refused and nothing is appealed because no decision is taken at all. A refugee arriving in Dubai is not rejected. A refugee arriving in Dubai is a category error. And closed is the wrong word for these countries in every other respect. Expatriates are around 89% of the population of the United Arab Emirates. Emiratis are roughly 11% of their own country, the highest share of foreign residents anywhere on the planet outside Vatican City. Qatar and Kuwait sit in similar territory. No societies in history have depended on imported labor as totally as these ones do. Which brings up the practical question almost nobody asks. Suppose a Syrian family in 2015 had wanted the Gulf rather than Germany. Could they have gone? Physically, no. There is no land route from Syria to Riyadh or Doha that a person without documents can walk. And there is no boat. But the real obstacle is not geography, it is sequence. Entry to a Gulf state requires a visa arranged in advance, and in most cases, a sponsor inside the country who is willing to hold your residence. The permission has to exist before you travel. That is the opposite of how asylum works. Asylum is a claim you make after you arrive.
It requires nothing beforehand, which is exactly why it is the only channel in the world available to a person with no documents, no employer, and no invitation. So the Gulf did not decide to take fewer refugees than Europe. It built a country you cannot enter without being chosen first. And refugees are, by definition, people nobody chose. When Syria collapsed after 2011, the Gulf did not seal itself off. Large numbers of Syrians came, and many of them are still there. They arrived on sponsored work visas, inside the ordinary labor system, and the researchers who study this call it asylum by proxy, the humanitarian outcome delivered by an employment mechanism, which sounds efficient until you put a sponsored visa and a refugee status side by side, because they are opposite things. A refugee status is a claim held against the state. It cannot be cancelled because business slowed down.
It carries protection against being returned to danger, access to services as of right, and in most systems, a road, however long and however grudging, to permanence. The center of it is a rule called non-refoulement. A country that has signed the convention may not send you back to a place where you are likely to be persecuted, and that obligation binds it whether or not it likes you, whether or not the public mood has turned, and whether or not an election is coming. It is the single promise that makes the rest of the system mean anything. A sponsored worker has nothing of the kind. What he has is a commercial agreement with a company. Residence hangs off that job. Lose the job, and the right to be in the country ends with it. Not by decision of a court, but by the expiry of a contract. There is no protection against removal, because there is nothing protected to remove. And the road to citizenship stays shut permanently, no matter how many decades go by. Two men can leave the same street in Aleppo in the same month, one landing in Frankfurt and one in Doha. Both alive, both housed, both working. One of them has acquired a legal relationship with a state, the other has acquired an employer. That is the whole answer. The rest of this video is why the Gulf built it that way and why it points everybody in one direction. So why will they not sign? 3 reasons, and none of them is the one usually assumed. The first is what a citizen actually is in a rentier state. Nationality there is not simply membership of a political community. It is closer to a share certificate. It carries entitlements to subsidized housing and energy, healthcare, education, grants of land and public sector employment, all funded out of a finite hydrocarbon endowment. Admitting permanent new members does not merely change the culture of the country, it divides the dividend more ways. The second is arithmetic, and it is brutal. Emiratis are 11% of the Emirates. Qataris and Kuwaitis are minorities at home as well. When nationals are already outnumbered 9-1, any legal mechanism that turns residents into permanent members stops being a policy debate and starts being, in the view of these governments, a question of survival. Europe argues about 10%. The Gulf would be arguing about 90%. The third reason is a memory, and it explains why the caution is sharpest towards fellow Arabs. In 1990, Iraq invaded Kuwait, and the Palestine Liberation Organization sided with Baghdad. Kuwait at that point had a Palestinian community of something like 400,000 people, many of them long-settled professionals who ran large parts of the country's administration. After liberation, they were gone. Between 380 and 400,000 people were expelled or prevented from returning, which remains the largest forced displacement of Palestinians from an Arab state. Around 200,000 were driven out by a campaign of pressure and violence between March and September of 1991. Another 200,000 who had left during the occupation were simply never allowed back. Relations with the Palestinian leadership were not repaired until a formal apology more than a decade afterwards. The lesson Gulf governments took from that is not a pleasant one, and it is rarely said out loud. A resident community with rights becomes a political actor. A political actor cannot be removed. Therefore, do not create the rights. Kafala is that conclusion written into law. Everyone is temporary, so everyone is removable. So nobody ever becomes a political actor. And in place of hosting, they pay. In 2025, the United Arab Emirates ranked as the 3rd largest humanitarian donor on Earth, providing about $1.46 billion, roughly 7.2% of all humanitarian funding recorded by the United Nations that year. Saudi Arabia has been the leading Gulf government donor to the UN Refugee Agency and has sat among its top 20 donors worldwide, moving money through bodies like the King Salman Relief Center across more than 30 years of partnership. Qatar gives steadily, averaging in the region of $80 million a year. Kuwait swings violently, $464 million in one year and $3 million in another. Stated plainly, the Gulf position is this: we will fund the camps, we will not house the people. Hold on to that sentence, because Europe has now written it into its own law. The solidarity mechanism in the European Union's Pact on Migration and Asylum allows a member state either to accept a share of arrivals or to pay instead. Europe spent a decade denouncing the Gulf for precisely this position, and then adopted it. And notice what the money is actually for. Funding a camp in Jordan or a reception system in Turkey is not charity in the ordinary sense. It is a payment made so that the people in that camp stay in that camp.
Every wealthy actor in this story, Gulf and European alike, has arrived at the same instrument: pay the neighboring country to hold the population, and the question never reaches your own territory. It works, mostly. That is why the numbers arriving in Europe are a small fraction of the numbers displaced. But containment is a bet on somebody else's stability, and the bet is now visibly losing. Now, the part that matters most, because it is happening as you watch this, and it demolishes the comfortable version of the argument. Iran and Pakistan did the thing everybody says the Gulf should have done. They hosted millions of Afghans next door to the war for 4 decades, with international funding that never came close to covering what it cost them. But they hosted them without status.
Most were never granted secure legal residence, full working rights, or any route to citizenship. Children were born there, grew up there, had children of their own there, and inherited the same provisional standing their grandparents arrived with. It is the same condition the Gulf engineers deliberately. Iran and Pakistan arrived at it by drift. And in 2023, both countries started sending them back. In 2025 alone, at least 2.8 million Afghans were returned. Around 1.8 million from Iran, roughly 930,000 from Pakistan. The UN Refugee Agency assessed 67% of those returns as forced, a 62% increase on the year before. In July, at the height of Iran's campaign, about 373,000 people crossed back over the border in a single month. The pace continued through 2026, carrying the cumulative total past 4.6 million. Half of everyone deported by Pakistan were women and girls, sent back to a country where the Taliban have banned them from secondary education and from most employment. Amnesty International calls the removals unlawful. 4 decades of hospitality reversed in about 18 months. Not by a court, not case by case, but by announcement. And there is the answer to the question in the title. Hosting people for decades without status is not a gentler alternative to the European system. It is a deferred expulsion. It holds for as long as the money holds and the politics hold. And when either gives way, the whole accumulated population goes back at once. So put yourself in the position of somebody deciding where to run, with a family, one attempt and no way back. In the Gulf, you can have work, safety, and a decade of ordinary life, and you can lose all of it the day a contract ends or a policy changes, with no hearing and no appeal, because there was never a decision to appeal against. In Turkey or Iran or Pakistan, you can be sheltered for 30 years and remain removable by decree, as 4.6 million Afghans have just discovered. In Europe, the moment your feet touch the ground, you can say one word and begin a legal process the state is not permitted to refuse to run, which has to be decided, which can be appealed, and which ends, if you win, in a status that no government can take back with a press conference. Nobody makes that journey because Europe is generous. Europe is not especially generous, and it is less generous now than at any point in 30 years. They make it because Europe is the only wealthy place on Earth where being there is a legal fact rather than a favor. And Europe understands this perfectly. Everything of the last 10 years, the deal with Turkey, the money for the Libyan Coast Guard, the offshore centers in Albania, the safe country lists, asylum suspended at the Belarusian border, return hubs in third countries, is one long attempt to shut a door that European law is not willing to abolish. What that has produced has no stable version. Europe now carries the obligations of a signatory and the enforcement capacity of a non-signatory. It promises a hearing to everyone who arrives, and then cannot decide quickly, cannot integrate reliably, and cannot remove the people it refuses. Around 27% of removal orders are actually carried out. 250,000 people live under toleration in Germany alone, present but not settled, which is precisely the condition Iran and Pakistan have just finished liquidating. The Gulf built a system in which nobody can ask, so nobody is ever refused.
Europe built one in which anyone can ask, most are refused, and few leave. So they are not running to Europe instead of their rich Muslim neighbors. They are running to the only place on earth where arriving is worth something, through a door that the people standing behind it have spent 10 years trying to close without ever admitting it is open.